Hey everyone, Travis here from Travis.media. Today we're going to build a simple desktop app using Rust in the Slint UI framework. Now I don't really care these days to build meaningless things that I can't use or that I can't offer to the public to use. I'm aiming for practical and I want to learn Rust better this year. So I built this little simple desktop app called Income Divider. And all it does, when I get paid or I receive some money in my business, I like to follow the profit first methodology, or a modified version of it. And what I do is I take the money and I divide it up into 4 parts. So let's say someone sent me $3,722. What I would do in the past is I would open up my calculator on my Macbook and I would type it in, 3722, and then I'd multiply it by 0.3 for taxes, and I'd find some piece of paper around my desk and I'd write it down. And I'd do the calculations this way, but I found that to be tedious and I found that it makes a big mess on my desk, so I just created this desktop app. And all I have to do, like I said, is put in the number, click calculate, and I get the amount I owe in taxes, the amount that I'm eventually going to pay myself out of it, the amount of profit I want to keep in my business, and the amount of operating expenses I also want to allocate. So it gave me a reason to practice my Rust and to learn to build desktop apps with it. And I looked around a little bit and I chose Slint to build it with. Now, Slint is a UI framework that supplies the user interface on your app. And then you have the freedom to perform the business logic with either Rust, C++, or Node.js. I'm going to be using Rust. So as far as Slint, there are a lot of use cases. There's embedded apps, desktop apps, industrial, consumer, automotive. So Slint, built with Rust, now supports QNX and is being used for building instrument clusters for motorcycles and two-wheelers. And then medical. They have some videos on it being used with the Raspberry Pi, supported boards. And then there's one case story I found interesting in that SK Signet, the #1 electric vehicle charging solution in the US, has transitioned their human-machine interface for their EV chargers from Qt to Slint. And if you look here, looks really nice, really modern. I don't have an electric vehicle, I don't know much about it, but it looks good. But what I'm getting at is it isn't just some side hobby app that nobody uses. It's pretty well known. So I chose to build the app with that. And just to note, Slint didn't sponsor this video. I have no affiliation with them. I just picked them based on what I read. Now, if you scroll up and go to Docs, you can choose between Rust, C++, and Node.js. So pick your tool and let's get started. I'm going to be using Rust, so I'm going to click on the project template. I'm going to open it in a new tab. And by the way, this tutorial is really good for learning how all this works. So if you go to your project template, which is a GitHub page, and just follow the instructions. So first step is install cargo generate. I've already done that. The next step is to create a new project with the template. So I'm going to copy this, open my terminal, go to my repos folder, and copy that command. And I'll change my project to something like income app. CD into that, cargo build, and then cargo run. And there's your app. The default app is just a counter. So counter equals 42. I can increase it by clicking here. That's all it is. But let's open it up in VS Code. And you have your normal files like your cargo toml file, your cargo lock. But what we're mainly interested in is this source folder and the UI folder. In your source folder, you have the main.rs. This is where your business logic is going to live. And we'll come to that in a minute. We're going to start off with the Slint part of it. So if you go to the UI folder, you have a file called appwindow.slint. Here, the counter equals 42. When the button is clicked, it calls this request increase value, which is this callback here. And then if you go to the Rust part of it, you'll see that it gets the counter and it sets the counter to whatever it is +1. That's all. So I'm actually going to comment this part out. And let's go to appwindow.slint and just get rid of all this. So you might be wondering, like, now I got to learn Slint, right? It's great that you can use Rust here, but why do I got to learn Slint? Well, here's the thing, and this is some good advice for 2024. When it comes to tools like this, you should be able to go to the documentation and get up to speed with Slint pretty quickly. If you haven't before, you want to focus more this year on concepts more than learning lots of languages. And here's what I mean. If we go back to the documentation and click on the Slint language, here's how you would approach this. So here's a getting started page. Tells you, hey, use VS Code, and then there's an extension. Go ahead and download that extension. Then you probably want to read the introduction under language reference. And then look under concepts. You probably want to read these, especially like positioning and layout of elements. But the next section called syntax, so you know what properties are and functions and callbacks and statements and conditional elements and repetitions or loops are. You know what these things are. So when you're writing this app, you should be able to, in your head, pseudocode everything, and then come here and figure out how to do it in Slint. It's a good skill to have. Be conceptual so that you have flexibility between languages more than just learning a bunch of languages. So I'm going to be building this, but we're going to be coming back here and referencing this syntax. Next, you have some built-in stuff and some widgets. So right here, this is how you get buttons and checkboxes, sliders, text edits, vertical boxes, all of that. Those are widgets. And then if you want to know how these work, there's a section called recipes and examples. So animation examples, layout examples, global callbacks, custom widgets, things you want to reference as you build. So to start, we may just want to go to layout examples and get an idea of like what this looks like. So let's scroll up to the top, and here's a clickable button. So we have a vertical box, and inside of it, we have a button. It's kind of like Flutter. So I can click the button press 1 time, 2 times. I can scroll down and see animation examples, states examples, layout examples. So here's 3 buttons in a vertical layout. Here's 3 buttons in a horizontal layout. Here's using grid box. So we got 2 rows, actually 3 rows, the 3rd row being a slider. And you get an idea of how to do this. So let's go back to our app and let's think about this. And you can open up any kind of diagramming tool like draw.io or something. But basically, just come in here. What do you want the app to look like? You can do this with a notepad as well. But let's say I just want it to look like this. I need some text here saying income divider, make that bigger. Then I want an input. Then I want a button below it that just says calculate. Now, if I go back and spend a few minutes in the documentation and go to something like under built-ins, if you go to built-in elements, you can find an item called grid layout. You have access to columns, rows, and things like that. So I could do a grid layout and have 3 rows in it. So if you go back to our diagram here, this would be a grid layout. This is row 1, row 2, and row 3, so that they're stacked on top of each other. Let's just do that. So let's go to our code and just type in grid layout. And within it, let's create a couple rows. Row 1, row 2, and row 3. And in row 1, let's do some text. Here's some text. And if you need to know what properties you can use with text, it's all listed right here. So I'm actually going to just copy this, go to my code, and paste that inside of row. And for text, I'm going to do enter total income. And remember, I mentioned installing that VS Code extension, so I can say horizontal alignment, and it shows me that that's available in a text element. Horizontal alignment, center. Font size, I'm going to make that big at like 24 pixels. And font weight, I'm going to make 900. I don't care anything about the color right now. But that's going to be our starting text. Now, what about our input? Let's go back and take a look. In addition to these built-in elements, you have widgets. So if you go to widgets and line edit, you'll see that it's a widget used to enter a single line of text. And here's an example here. I can click on it, I can type text in it. So I'm going to use that. So I'm going to copy this and paste that in my 2nd row. And I get this red squiggly because I need to import it. And the easiest way to do that is just to highlight it, start typing, and accept the auto suggestion. And you'll see it's added here at the top. And here I'm going to have the placeholder text of enter your number. Font size, I'm going to make 16. And I'll leave it at that. And then finally, we need a button. And I think that's also under widgets. Yeah, here's a button. So this one's simple. Let's just go back, type in button. And text is going to be calculate. And that looks good for now. And this VS Code extension, you can actually open your command palette. And there's an option that says Slint Show Preview. If you click that, it'll show you a preview of your app. And there it is. Looks all jammed together. So let's add some padding. In this grid layout, we can do padding, 50 pixels. And then also, if we go back to built-ins and built-in elements, and grid layout, I think they have a spacing element. Yeah, spacing, the distance between elements in the layout. So let's also do spacing 25 pixels. And save that, see what it looks like. Looks way better. This enter your number, let's center that by doing horizontal alignment, center. See if that fixes it. Yep. And then calculate. This button is gray. So let's go back to the documentation on that. And there's a property called primary. If set to true, the button is displayed with the primary accent color. So let's change it to primary true. And that looks better. As for the background color, let's go to the main window and do background. And I have a color 313E50, which is like a dark blue. Change it to that, and it looks better. And then these look really narrow. So let's go to the line edit and do height 35 pixels. And then the button, let's do height of the same thing, 35 pixels. And that looks great. So like I said, you just have to go and look at what properties each widget or built-in element has with it. Now that's the Slint live preview. Let's actually compile it and see what it looks like. So cargo run. Yeah, and it looks about the same. So that's good. Now, in case you're wondering, I didn't even talk about this, but this is a .slint file. This is going to be your UI. And you see here it exports component app window. This can be named anything you want. And it inherits the window component. So within this, you can do all your UI editing. You can also create another component. Like I can do component, let's just do it. Component, calculate button. And then here, I can actually just put this button that I have here, place it there. And then down here, I can just call calculate button. And it's the same thing. So you can make your app a lot cleaner by breaking things up a bit. But we don't need to do that. This is a small app. So I'm going to undo that. Now we have the front end working, but it does nothing. So we need to jump over to the business logic, which in my case is Rust. It might be C++ or Node.js for you, but we need to jump into the back end and figure out how this all works. So if we go to main.rs, here's what's going on. We have a main function, it returns a result. Within that, we're declaring a new app window. So app window, of course, corresponds to our component. It's called app window. And then we create a weak pointer to it, which is explained in the documentation if you don't know what that means. And then you unwrap that weak pointer here in this closure. But what is this UI.onRequestIncreaseValue? Well, if you remember when we created this template, if I go back to the GitHub repo, there was a callback called requestIncreaseValue. And then when you click the button, it called that callback. Now, if we go to the documentation, the Slint documentation, and we go to concepts or actually syntax and callbacks, you'll see here that components may declare callbacks that communicate changes of the state to the outside. Callbacks are invoked by calling them like you would call a function. So when this requestIncreaseValue is called, it's going to use this getter and setter, so get counter, set counter, to do its thing. So if I go back to what was originally there, you'll see that there's a property called counter. So all you do in the business logic side is you add set to whatever that property was. So set counter, get counter, or on to the callback. So if you look at the documentation for Rust, the Rust API, and you scroll down, you see here, for each top level property, there's a setter and a getter. So you can call set underscore whatever the property name is, or get underscore property name. Same thing for each top level callback. There's an invoke underscore callback name, or an on underscore callback name. And this documentation is really good. It's done really well. So what we want to do is when we click this button, let's go back to the UI. When we click this button, which on button, you can just say clicked. There's a property called clicked. You can call something. So let's go here and go to properties. And it's very easy. It's just property, the type, and then the name of the property. So I'm going to grab this, and there's different qualifiers that specify how the property can be read and written. There's a private, which is the default. It can be an input, an output, or an in-out. So I'm just going to start with private. So up here at the very top, I'll create a new property. The type is going to be a string, and we'll call it results. And I'll set it to an empty string. This is going to be our results. When we click the button, we want to display that calculated income in a window at the bottom. Next, when we click this button, we want to invoke this callback, which we hadn't created yet, called divide income. Inside of it, we want to put whatever input that we put in this line edit. So up here under line edit, let's just call, you can actually assign variables to this. So I can say income, and then it's kind of like a Go syntax here. But income equals this line edit component. So down here, I can just do income.text. I'm going to pass in the number that we input, basically. And then as far as callbacks, if we go to the documentation and callbacks, you'll see an example here of callback of hello, and then you're passing in some kind of arguments. So up here under this property, we'll just put our callback, and we'll call it divide income. And we just need to pass in a string value. Great, so when we click this button, we invoke this divide income callback, which is up here. And we're going to do some calculations and display them in results. So let's create a little place in the bottom to display these results. So let's create a new row, and inside of it, create a vertical box, and in that a rectangle. Let's do a height of 100 pixels, a background of, let's do F2, 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 and that looks pretty good. And then inside of that rectangle, let's do a text component, or widget, I guess is the proper term, with a color of black. The text should be black. Let's make the font size 16 pixels and font weight a little bigger at 500. And then the text itself should be the results, right? So to access this results property, since it's outside of this grid layout and the rows and all of that, we can do root.results. This is all in the documentation. Root gives you access to that root component, the root part of the component. Then you can also use self for the component itself. All right, so I think we're ready to go over to Rust and make this magic happen. So here at the top, I'm gonna give my calculations. The tax percentage is going to be a float 64 and is going to be 0.30, so 30%. Copy this. The owner percentage will be 55. The profit percentage will be 5%. And the operating expenses percentage will be 10%. And that should equal 100, 60, 70, 90, 100, yeah, 100%. And so here, instead of on request increase value, we'll do on divide income. So it already recognizes that callback that's available to me. So what do we need to do now? Well, if you go back, you see that we actually pass in a string to that divide income. And just a note, in Slint, it's going to be divide dash income, but when you get over to Rust, it's going to use underscores. And it knows the difference there. So save this, that's fine on divide income. So what I need to do is I need to pass in the string. And that string is actually going to be a number, so let's parse it. Let num of float64 equals string.trim, always got to trim first, .parse.unwrap. So we're going to turn that string into a float64. Then we need to get the percentages of this number. So let tax of F64 equal num times tax percentage. Copy that 4 times. Let's do owner, num times owner percentage. Profit, num times profit percentage. And then operating expenses, OPEX, num times operating expenses, percentage. Save that. And actually, we didn't put our parentheses here, so that's a problem. And the same thing with unwrap. What are we doing? And then let's let result equals, we'll do a format. Here we'll do taxes, new line, owner, new line, profit, new line, and operating expenses. And then our arguments. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Tax, owner, profit, and operating expenses. Save it. And this needs to be a decimal place of 2. So inside of these, we'll put :2. I think that does it. Let me word wrap. Here we go. And now I should be able to use that setter we talked about earlier, UI.set. What are we setting? The results property to result. And we seem to have an error here. If I hover over it, it says method set results is private. So we need to go back to our Slint file, and I need to set this property, which is private by default, to be an input by putting in front of it. Remember, there's an input, there's an output, and then there's an input output. So I think doing an input should be enough. If I go back, there's still an error. And if this happens, just resave it. And that fixed that. Now we have an issue with result. And it tells us here that we need to add into to this result. So result.into, that's in the documentation if you're wondering what that does. But now when I save it, we should be good. I can now set the result to whatever we calculate here. And then in our Slint file, that should show up down here in the text of root results. So let's try it out. And let's actually run the app. Cargo run. And let's do like 4,000. Actually, let's do 100 because it's easy to calculate. Click calculate. And we get the right numbers, but we have this weird decimal thing going on. I thought we fixed that. So if we go back to main.rs, it's actually :2. That should do it. Let's rebuild this and try it out again. So let's do 1,000, calculate. There we have it, 300, 550, 50, 100. Great. So at this point, you have a fully working app. You can do cargo build, release to get you an optimized binary. And then, of course, we don't want to have to find this binary every time we want to run it. I would rather make it an app on my Mac so that I can find it in my Spotlight. Income divider, there it is. And to do that, we use cargo bundle. So to get that working, we need to run cargo install cargo bundle. So here in my app, I'll do that. Cargo install cargo bundle. And then according to the documentation, we need to add a package metadata bundle to our cargo.toml file. So here at the bottom, let's add that. And then we'll need a name, an identifier, and a description. And let's copy this identifier, this GitHub identifier. So name equals income divider. Identifier equals, I'm going to change my username to my username. And then my project on GitHub is this. So I'm going to copy this project name, paste that in here. And then finally, we need to add a description to the package. So description equals a desktop app that divides up income. And then the final step is to run cargo bundle with the release flag. Hit return. Now if I look in my target folder in release, I have a bundle folder. Open that. Actually, let's open it up in Finder. Open up bundle, OS X, and there's my app. I simply just drag that to applications. But let's take this a step further and add this animation. So if I put 1,000, when I click calculate, we can set it so a window opens. So click calculate and this window opens to our numbers. This will teach you how to use the animation. So let's go back to app window, and under the rectangle that shows our results, let's create two more rectangles. Let's call this left rectangle and then right rectangle. You'll see why in a minute. And rectangle for that one and the rectangle for our left one. Now the background for these, let's make as almost black. So 333, 333. Paste that also on the right rectangle. So what's going to happen here is you have two rectangles that are opening like a curtain. So this first rectangle starts out as x0. It starts out right at the 0 position. Think of x like 0 to 100 or whatever. x0 is going to be all the way out the picture. And then when we click the button, we want it to come in halfway. So we can do like parent width divided by 2. And then when we click it again, it goes back to 0. So it's just this left panel coming in and coming out. And when we do the right panel, we needed to start at the end of it and come in halfway and back out halfway. So let's try this. Let's go up here and let's create another property. Let's do in out. And it's going to be a type of bool. And let's call it open curtain, because the curtain is being opened. What we do is when we click on it, we're going to set that to true. When we click on it again, it's going to set to false, and it's just going to be a toggle. So in our first rectangle, when it comes to width, we're going to put open curtain. If that's false, the width is going to be 0. But if it's true, the width is going to be parent.width, which is going to be the full width of the parent divided by 2. That's going to take it to the halfway position. And then for height, we want it the full height of the parent. So parent.height. And then for animate, let's go to animations. And there's a whole bunch of animations here, these values here, and work with that. So we're going to animate the width. And let's put these values in here. For duration, let's do 250 milliseconds. And for easing, let's do ease in. And that should do it. Now the right rectangle is a little bit trickier. So the X, if open curtain is false, then the X position should be outside of the right side, which is going to be the full width of the parent. So parent.width, else it needs to be parent.width divided by 2, which is going to bring it in halfway. That's the X position. Now the width needs to be, if open curtain, then the width needs to be 0 pixels, meaning the X is going to be all the way to the right and it's not going to have any width at all. But if that's true, it also needs to be parent width divided by 2. Height is going to be parent.height. And then we need to animate 2 things this time. So animate width. It's going to be like the last one, duration, 250, ease in. Then we also need to animate the X to the same thing. Let's run that and try it out. Cargo run. And so we have our window here. Remember, our window is almost black. Let's put in a number like 5,000. And when we click calculate, they should open to our numbers. And nothing happens because we didn't set the click. So let's go find our button. Clicked, we want 2 things to happen. Before we actually divide the income, in here we can do root.openCurtain is equal to not root.openCurtain. So again, this is just a toggle. Every time we click this, it's going to flip to the other thing. False, true, false, true. So let's save it, try it again. Type in a number like 5,000. Click calculate, and it opens. Click calculate again, it closes. So that's pretty neat. And guys, this is basically the tip of the iceberg. There's so much you can do here. You can actually access elements on your computer, and you can get way more advanced and intricate than this. But this is just a simple app, a way for me to speed up things in my business, and also a way for me to practice using Rust, which is a goal I have this year. I'll link to the GitHub repo below if you got stuck. If you found this video helpful, you like this kind of thing, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, consider doing so, and I'll see you in the next video.